Look, I didn't do anything wrong. Just told him the truth. That if I had to do it all over again, I'd probably marry my best friend instead. I thought he'd argue, maybe get jealous, maybe finally fight for me. But he didn't say a word. He just walked into the study, came back with a folder, and handed me divorce papers. Before we dive deeper into the story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I didn't think I did anything wrong, just said what everyone already knew. I told him, right there at the dinner table, that if I had to do it all over again, I'd probably marry Evan instead. I even laughed when I said it. I thought it was harmless honesty, something he'd roll his eyes at and forget. But Daniel didn't laugh. He didn't even look up from his plate. He just went quiet in that heavy way of his, the kind that fills a room faster than shouting ever could. We'd been married for 9 years. 2 kids, 1 mortgage, 1 routine that had long stopped feeling like life. Dinner, dishes, silence. Daniel always sat across from me like a ghost, chewing quietly, answering questions in half sentences. He used to talk about his students, about new lesson plans, about wanting to start a garden. But lately, he'd stopped. I thought maybe he'd run out of things to say, or maybe he'd stopped caring. I never imagined he was listening more carefully than ever. That night had started normally enough. The girls were upstairs drawing, and I'd made pasta, the kind Evan taught me to make when we were still in college. Daniel had noticed the smell and said it reminded him of our early years. I told him it reminded me of Evan. He smiled weakly and said, "You still talk to him a lot." I said, "Of course, he's my best friend." Then, without thinking much, I added, "Honestly, if I could go back in time, I think I'd marry Evan instead." The words just came out. I didn't mean them as an insult, just as a truth. The kind of truth people should be able to say when they're comfortable. But the silence that followed made my skin prickle. Daniel didn't raise his voice or ask questions. He just kept his eyes on the table, then calmly stood up and took his plate to the sink. I tried to joke that he was taking things too seriously, that he needed to learn how to handle honesty. Still, no reaction. I said he was always too sensitive, that this was exactly why I could talk to Evan more easily. I said it softly, but I wanted it to sting. I wanted him to show something, anything. Instead, he walked past me, into the study, and closed the door. The sound of that latch echoed louder than any argument we'd ever had. 5 minutes later, he came back out carrying a folder. I thought it was work stuff, maybe school papers. He placed it on the table in front of me and said, very quietly, "I already signed." I frowned, confused. He pointed at the top of the page, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." I actually laughed at first, said something like, "What, you keep divorce papers ready just in case?" He said, "No, I had them ready for when you finally said it out loud." For a moment I couldn't breathe. I asked him what he meant. He said he'd known for a long time that I was emotionally somewhere else, that I'd left before I realized it. I told him he was being dramatic, that people can be close friends without crossing lines. He said he wasn't angry, just done pretending. I told him he was throwing away 9 years of marriage over a sentence. He said, "You didn't say a sentence, you said everything." Then he picked up his jacket, put his keys in his pocket, and left. No shouting, no slammed door, just quiet footsteps fading down the driveway. I sat there staring at the papers. His signature was neat, careful, dated 2 weeks earlier. That meant he'd already planned this. I flipped through the pages, my hands trembling. It wasn't just a draft. It had sections for custody, property division, even visitation schedules. I told myself it was just something he printed in a moment of weakness, some fantasy of independence. He'd cool off, he always did. I called my mother. She asked what happened, and I told her I was just being honest, that Daniel couldn't handle a joke. She said I'd always been too direct, but that it was good I was speaking my mind. maybe it's time he appreciates what he has before someone else does, she said. I took that as comfort. Then I called Evan. I told him Daniel had overreacted, that I'd made a joke and it turned into a meltdown. He went quiet for a second and said, maybe I shouldn't have said that. I told him he didn't understand, that Daniel had been distant for months. Evan sighed and said he didn't want to be in the middle. I said he already was, whether he liked it or not. When I hung up, I noticed Daniel's phone charger was gone, his toothbrush too. The house felt colder, emptier. I tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a message saying he was being ridiculous, that we could talk in the morning. I almost said, I love you, but stopped myself. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying his calmness in my head. The way he'd said, I had them ready for when you finally said it out loud. How long had he been waiting for me to fail? Had he known all along about my feelings for Evan? Maybe he'd been keeping score while I thought he was just quiet. In the middle of the night, I went downstairs and picked up the folder again. My name looked strange printed beside his. I ran my fingers over the ink, wondering what he thought as he signed it. Did he feel free or just tired? When dawn came, I looked out the window, expecting to see his car in the driveway. It wasn't there. Instead, the morning light hit the papers still sitting on the table, and for the first time, I realized something terrifying. He hadn't left in anger. He'd left in certainty. I told myself he'd be back once he realized I didn't mean it. I always found ways to talk him down before. But as I watched the light move across that stack of papers, I had the sinking feeling that this time, Daniel wasn't waiting for an apology. He was waiting for an ending. I woke up late the next morning, still half hoping I'd hear his car in the driveway or his voice downstairs making coffee. The house was silent except for the refrigerator hum and the soft sound of the girls' feet upstairs. I told myself he just needed time. Men always need time. They storm off, then realize what they're losing. That's what I believed. I called him 3 times before noon. Straight to voicemail. I left one message saying I was sorry if what I said hurt him, another saying we should talk, and a third reminding him the girls had piano that evening. No reply. I texted Evan instead. He answered within minutes, saying I should give Daniel space. He added that maybe it wasn't a good idea to talk to him for a few days. That irritated me. He'd always been on my side. Now he was giving me measured advice like I was some co-worker. By lunchtime, my mother called. She'd already heard about the fight, probably from one of Daniel's relatives. She said I shouldn't worry, that men like Daniel always calm down after they've had their little ego bruise. I told her he'd left divorce papers. She gasped, then said he was bluffing. No one just hands those out overnight, she said. I wanted to believe her. I told her he'd probably copied them from the internet to scare me. She said that sounded right. That made me feel better. Still, I couldn't stand the emptiness of the house. I took the girls to my mother's for dinner. She hugged me and said I looked pale. Over the table, she kept reassuring me I'd done the right thing by speaking my truth. She said too many women waste their lives pretending to be content. I nodded but didn't say much. Her words didn't comfort me the way they used to. Later that evening, I checked Daniel's social media. His profile picture was still us at Ella's birthday, but all the recent photos of me were gone. I told myself maybe he was just hiding them to make a point. I didn't cry. I was angry. I thought about posting something, maybe a photo with Evan, just to remind everyone that I wasn't the problem, but that felt too obvious. Instead, I posted a quote, "Honesty may hurt, but lies kill slowly." Within minutes, I got likes from friends, including Evan. That helped. The next day at work, the whispers started. I could feel people's eyes on me in the break room. One of my co-workers, Jenna, finally asked if everything was okay. I told her Daniel was overreacting to a comment, that he'd always been sensitive about Evan because he couldn't handle being compared. She gave me a sympathetic look but didn't say anything. I could tell she didn't want to get involved. Around 3, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Ms. Vale, please confirm receipt of legal correspondence via courier. I frowned. I hadn't received anything. Then another message followed. Document delivery scheduled for tomorrow morning, per Mr. Vale's counsel. Counsel. The word made me stop breathing for a second. I called my mother in a panic. She told me again that he was bluffing, that lawyers don't send texts. I wanted to agree, but my stomach twisted. I didn't reply to the message. I told myself it was some automated mistake. Still, I barely slept that night. When the courier came the next morning, I almost didn't open the door. He handed me a thick envelope with the Gray and Thornton logo. I knew that name. It was the same firm people mentioned in town when they talked about serious cases. I signed for it, shut the door, and ripped it open at the kitchen table. Inside was a letter addressed to me, outlining Daniel's intent to proceed with formal dissolution proceedings. It mentioned financial assets, shared accounts, and temporary custody arrangements. The language was so calm it almost sounded polite. I read it twice, hoping it was some legal misunderstanding. Then I noticed the date. The papers had been filed 2 days before our dinner. He'd been planning this before I even said it. The thought made my hands shake. I called Evan again. He answered after the second ring. I told him Daniel was getting lawyers involved. He said maybe I should talk to one too, just in case. I asked if he thought I'd done something wrong. He hesitated too long. I snapped, said, "You're just like him. You don't get it." He said quietly that he didn't want to be part of this and hung up. That silence hit harder than I expected. Evan had always been my escape, my proof that I wasn't unlovable. Without his validation, everything started to feel less certain. Later that afternoon, my mother called again. She'd spoken to Daniel's mother, Irene. Apparently, Irene had told her that Daniel wasn't angry, just focused. That word scared me. I'd seen Daniel focused before, but never on me. He used to use that voice for work projects or fixing things around the house. Practical, patient, unshakable. If he was applying that same energy to divorce, I knew I was in trouble. That night, I tried calling him again. Voicemail. I left one last message, saying he was making a mistake, that he'd regret throwing everything away. I told him I still loved him, even if I wasn't sure what that meant anymore. I waited, staring at the phone until the screen went dark. The next morning, a new email appeared in my inbox. No text, just an attachment. When I opened it, I saw the same documents from the envelope, now electronically signed and time-stamped. At the bottom was a line that made my stomach drop. Respondent to provide disclosure within 10 business days. Respondent. That was me. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at that word. In every story I'd ever told myself, I was the one explaining, justifying, convincing. I'd never been the one being formally addressed, listed like a problem. By noon, my mother came over again, but even she looked uneasy now. She asked if I'd spoken to a lawyer. I said no. She said I should, before he decides everything without you. The idea that Daniel could decide something, anything, without my say felt unbearable. I told her he wouldn't go through with it. She didn't reply. After she left, I walked through the house, touching the furniture we'd bought together, the photos still hanging. I told myself this was just a dramatic phase, a scare tactic, but deep down I could feel it. Daniel wasn't bluffing. He was building something, slowly, carefully, the same way he built everything he ever cared about. And this time, it wasn't for us. It was against me. The next weekend was the neighborhood barbecue, the kind of event Daniel never missed. Every year he helped set up the tents, grilled burgers, chatted with the other dads. I almost didn't go, but my mother insisted. She said showing up would prove strength. I wanted to believe that, so I put on a light sundress, curled my hair, and told myself I'd look confident. If people saw I was fine, they'd stop whispering. When I arrived, everyone was already there. Kids running around, music playing, the smell of smoke and ketchup in the air. I noticed immediately that Daniel wasn't at the grill this time. One of his co-workers was handling it instead. I asked someone if Daniel was coming, pretending not to care. They shrugged and said he'd said something about finishing paperwork. That phrase made my stomach twist. Evan was there too, standing near the drink table, talking with a few people I barely knew. He smiled when he saw me, but it was the kind of smile that asked me not to make things complicated. I walked over anyway. I told him I was fine, that everything was just legal noise, that Daniel was trying to scare me. He nodded politely, said, maybe I should just stay calm. That tone, gentle, distant, infuriated me. I asked if he was avoiding me. He said he didn't want to fuel gossip. I laughed too loudly and said people were going to talk either way. Still, I stayed near him, even when I could feel the stares. Someone whispered behind me, something about poor Daniel. I turned and smiled as if I didn't hear. When Evan tried to excuse himself to help with the food, I caught his arm and said he shouldn't act guilty. He froze, pulled away, and said I was making things harder. His politeness felt like rejection. Half an hour later, my mother arrived with the girls. She told me to smile more, to control the story. So I did. I laughed louder, played with the kids, complimented people's outfits, made sure everyone saw me being cheerful. I could feel the relief in her eyes, like maybe if I looked happy enough, she wouldn't have to defend me later. Then Daniel showed up. He walked in like nothing was wrong, wearing that quiet confidence that used to calm me, but now just made me nervous. People greeted him kindly, almost warmly. I realized, too late, that no one saw him as the villain. They saw him as the wounded one, the man trying to hold things together. He made his way through the crowd, shaking hands, smiling softly. When he reached me, I tried to look unaffected. I said, "You finally decided to join us," he said, "just dropping by for a bit." His tone was so polite it made me furious. Before I could respond, he pulled a white envelope from his jacket and handed it to me. He said, "You'll need this soon." I blinked, completely thrown off. "What is it?" I asked. He said, "It's just time catching up." Then he walked away before I could say anything else. I stood there holding the envelope while everyone pretended not to watch. My mother whispered, asking what it was. I said I didn't know. I wanted to tear it open right there, but I didn't want to give anyone the satisfaction. So I smiled, excused myself, and went to my car. Inside, with the windows rolled up, I opened it. It was an official notice from Gray and Thornton, notice of financial separation and custody mediation date. My hand started shaking. The words felt unreal. There were details about our assets, the children's arrangements, even references to evidence previously submitted. Evidence? My breath caught. I called my mother immediately. She told me to calm down, that paperwork didn't mean anything final. I told her he'd already set a court date. She paused and said maybe I should talk to him before things got ugly. But I couldn't. He'd blocked me everywhere. I sat there in the car for almost an hour. People outside were laughing, kids running past, and I was holding the proof that my marriage wasn't breaking. It was already broken. I felt this strange mix of rage and disbelief. He wasn't supposed to act first. That was my role. I was the one who decided when things fell apart, not him. When I finally went back outside, Evan tried to speak to me, but I ignored him. I didn't want pity. My mother was talking with one of Daniel's friends, trying to sound casual, but her forced smile told me she was scared. For the first time, she didn't seem sure which side to stand on. Later that evening, when most people had left, Daniel came back with the girls. They ran to me, laughing, and I forced a smile. He stood a few feet away and said quietly that he'd drop them off at school in the morning. I said that was my job. He replied, "Not anymore, at least for now." Then he got in his car and left before I could ask what that meant. The moment the car disappeared, I felt my throat close up. My mother came over, trying to comfort me, but I pushed her hand away. She said he was probably bluffing. I said he didn't bluff. Not like this. That night, I drove home with the girls half asleep in the back seat. When I tucked them into bed, Ella asked if Daddy was mad. I told her no, that he was just figuring things out. She said quietly, "He looked happier today." I didn't know what to say. Downstairs, I poured a glass of wine and stared at the envelope again. His tone replayed in my mind. "You'll need this soon." There was no anger in his voice, only certainty. That scared me more than any threat. For a while, I tried to convince myself he was just pushing boundaries, trying to get a reaction. Maybe he thought he could scare me into begging. But deep down, I could feel the shift. Daniel wasn't bluffing, and he wasn't emotional. He was strategic. Before bed, I checked my email again, hoping for a message from Evan or Daniel. Nothing. Just silence. I lay awake for hours, thinking about how quickly control can slip away without anyone noticing. It wasn't just the marriage anymore. It was my version of the story that was crumbling. When the morning light crept through the blinds, I realized I was no longer the one deciding how things would end. Daniel had already written the next chapter, and I was just waiting to find out how bad it would get. I spent the next few days in a kind of fog, pretending everything was fine. I still got the girls ready for school, still went to work, still smiled when people asked how I was. But underneath, I could feel the ground shifting. The envelope from the barbecue sat on the kitchen counter, like a warning I refused to read again. I told myself it was just paperwork, that Daniel wouldn't actually go through with it. Not really. He'd calm down like he always did. By midweek, Evan finally texted me, "Hope you're okay." That was all. No call, no real check-in, just those 3 words. I stared at the message for a long time before replying, "I'm fine." He's being dramatic. Evan didn't respond. I waited an hour, then sent another. "You know me better than anyone, right? You know I didn't mean what I said." Still nothing. I threw my phone onto the couch, furious. That evening, I called my mother again. She said she'd talked to Irene, and that Daniel wasn't angry, just focused. I laughed bitterly and said, "He's turning this into a performance." My mother said I shouldn't have humiliated him. I reminded her that honesty isn't humiliation. She sighed and told me maybe I should stop saying that. I decided I'd confront Daniel myself. I didn't care if he ignored my calls. I'd find him in person. After work, I drove straight to his classroom at the high school. I knew he stayed late most afternoons grading papers. The parking lot was almost empty when I arrived. Through the window, I saw him sitting at his desk, talking to another teacher. He looked calm, even cheerful. That infuriated me. I waited until the other teacher left, then walked in. He looked up, surprised but not shaken. I told him we needed to talk. He said there was nothing left to say. I said he was being cruel, freezing me out of my own life. He said, "You did that yourself." I asked if he really planned to take the girls from me. He said he planned to protect them from chaos. I laughed and told him I wasn't chaotic, just passionate. He said, "Call it what you want." When I tried to touch his arm, he stepped back. That tiny movement stung more than anything he could have said. I told him he was turning everyone against me. He said no one needed his help for that. Then he picked up his papers, said he had work to do, and asked me to leave before he had to call security. I left before the janitor saw me crying. That night, I drove to Evan's apartment. He opened the door looking tired. I told him Daniel was trying to destroy me. Evan said maybe Daniel was just setting boundaries. I asked what that meant. He said softly that maybe we'd blurred too many lines, that Daniel had every reason to feel hurt. I stared at him, shocked. "You think this is my fault?" I asked. He didn't answer, just said he couldn't keep getting involved. When I asked if he was choosing Daniel over me, he said, "I'm choosing peace." That word again. Peace. I left before I started yelling. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother asking if I was home safe. I didn't answer. Instead, I drove past Daniel's workshop. The lights were on. I knew I shouldn't stop, but curiosity pulled me in. Inside, everything looked cleaner than I remembered. Organized. On his desk was a neat stack of folders. I told myself I wasn't snooping. I was protecting myself. I opened the top drawer and found 3 binders labeled with dates. The first one said correspondence, the second financial records, and the third personal accounts. I opened the last one. My stomach dropped. Inside were printed screenshots of messages. Mine. Texts between me and Evan. Screenshots from my social media. Timestamps of lunches. Even photos from the cafe where we met. Every detail was labeled, cross-referenced with dates and receipts. There were notes in Daniel's handwriting, pattern of communication, emotional dependency, use of marital funds. He'd been tracking everything for months. I flipped through the pages faster, my heart pounding. He had copies of emails, restaurant bills, even a printout of the dinner receipt from the night I'd made the comment about Evan. I wanted to believe it was fake, but I recognized my own words. I suddenly understood what his silence had been all along. Not weakness, not distance, but preparation. A noise outside made me jump. I quickly shoved everything back and closed the drawers. When I turned around, the workshop door was still open. No one was there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had seen me. I drove home trembling, replaying everything in my head. Back in the house, I poured a glass of wine and tried to calm down. My mind kept circling the same thought. He'd been planning this. Every calm answer, every quiet evening, every time he let me talk myself into trouble. All of it had been part of his plan. I told myself it was manipulative, even cruel. What kind of person collects evidence against their own spouse? Still, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining those binders lined up, waiting like weapons. Around 2 a.m, I texted my mother and told her I thought Daniel was setting me up. She replied hours later, "He's protecting himself, Corinne. You should have expected this." The next day, I received another email from his lawyer, asking for updated financial disclosures. There was a list of dates and accounts I recognized, including the ones I'd used for lunches with Evan. I wanted to scream. He was turning every detail into ammunition. That night, I looked around the house and realized how much of it was his. The furniture, the mortgage, even the bills in his name. Everything I thought was shared had already been quietly divided. I tried to convince myself I still had control, but the truth was written all over the paper trail he'd built. Before bed, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. I told myself I wasn't the villain, that I'd just wanted honesty, connection, something real. But as I looked at my own tired face, I couldn't ignore the simple fact. Daniel hadn't shouted, threatened, or begged. He'd just acted. And the quietness of it made me realize I'd already lost far more than an argument. I'd lost the power to tell the story my way. The mediation date came sooner than I was ready for. A week after finding those binders, I received an email confirming the session. "Mandatory attendance required," it said. The words made my stomach churn. My mother told me to stay calm, to dress well, to remind him who he married. She said men like Daniel fall apart when women act composed. I wanted to believe her. That Friday morning, I stood in front of the mirror for almost an hour before leaving. I chose a navy blouse, tied my hair back neatly, and practiced my expression. Concerned, not guilty. I told myself if I spoke clearly enough, they'd all see reason. Daniel was being vindictive, using paperwork to get attention. That's what I believed as I walked into the office of Gray and Thornton. The building smelled like coffee and disinfectant. A receptionist led me to a glass conference room. Daniel was already there, sitting at one end of the table with his lawyer. He didn't look tired or bitter. He looked centered. That calm made me furious. My lawyer sat beside me, younger than I'd expected. flipping nervously through his notes. Across the table, Daniel's lawyer, a woman with a calm voice and precise tone, greeted me politely. The mediator introduced himself, a man in his 60s, who smiled too kindly. He said we were here to find closure and clarity. I started first. I said Daniel was being unreasonable, that we'd both made mistakes. I said I hadn't cheated, not really, that I'd only confided in a friend who understood me. I said Daniel had been cold and distant for years, that he'd left me emotionally long before I ever leaned on anyone else. I spoke softly, letting my voice shake just enough to sound wounded. When I finished, the mediator nodded and asked Daniel's lawyer to respond. She opened a folder labeled Exhibits. One by one, she slid documents across the table. Hotel receipts, credit card transactions, text transcripts, and screenshots of my messages to Evan. My throat tightened. Some were months old, from times I could barely remember. She explained that Daniel had collected evidence to show a consistent emotional and financial boundary violation. She spoke calmly, as if she were reading weather data, not dissecting my life. I turned to Daniel, expecting him to stop it, to tell her that was enough. But he just sat there, silent. I said it was obsessive, that no healthy person keeps files like that. The mediator raised his hand for me to let her finish. She did. She presented a separate report on household finances, showing transfers from our joint account for restaurant bills and weekend trips. She ended by submitting a summary of witness statements from neighbors, co-workers, even my own sister, who had apparently confirmed my closeness with Evan. I felt heat climb up my neck. I said this was ridiculous, that everyone was twisting harmless things into proof. I told them Daniel had been controlling for years, that this was all about punishing me for speaking my truth. The mediator asked me to breathe and respond calmly. I said calmness wasn't an option when I was being attacked. Daniel finally spoke. His voice was steady. "I'm not attacking you, Corinne. I'm done defending myself." I told him he was abandoning his family. He said, "You left long before I did." The room went silent after that. My lawyer leaned over and whispered that I should stop arguing, that I was making myself look unstable. That word, unstable, made me snap. I told everyone I wasn't unstable, that I was just passionate, human, flawed. The mediator called for a short recess. In the hallway, my lawyer asked if I wanted to settle before things got worse. I asked what worse meant. He said Daniel's lawyer had enough to push for full custody and primary property rights. I laughed and said Daniel would never take the kids from me. My lawyer looked at me for a long time before saying he already filed for it. When we went back in, the mediator asked if either party wished to make final statements before drafting recommendations. Daniel nodded. He said he wasn't angry, only relieved that everything was finally out in the open. He said he wanted peace for himself and the girls. His voice didn't shake once. I tried to speak, but my throat felt locked. My lawyer said we'd review the documents privately. The mediator summarized. Daniel would retain temporary custody pending court approval. The house, too, would remain under his name until final division. My lawyer signed a temporary acknowledgement on my behalf. I didn't even process it until the pen left the paper. When it ended, everyone stood. Daniel shook the mediator's hand and thanked him. I just stared. I wanted him to yell, to act human, but he didn't. He simply gathered his papers, said, "Take care, Corinne," and left. I sat there long after he was gone. Outside, the air felt heavier than before. My mother called, asking how it went. I told her he'd humiliated me. She asked if I'd done anything to make it easier for him. I said, "You sound just like him." She didn't reply. That night, I sat in the living room surrounded by folders and notes. Every photo, every receipt, every word I'd said in that room replayed in my head. I poured a drink, staring at the custody line in the paperwork. Temporary residence of minors to remain with petitioner until further order of court. I told myself I'd fight it. I'd tell the judge I was the stable one, the mother, the heart of the family. But deep down, I knew Daniel had already won in the only way that mattered, not because of the law, but because he'd stayed calm when I hadn't. Before I went to bed, I looked at my reflection in the dark window and whispered, "He thinks this is peace." Then, quieter, "But he doesn't know how loud silence can be." I wanted to believe that, but the truth was, he did know. He'd built it piece by piece, until it became a wall I couldn't climb. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. Even the air seemed to belong to him. His jacket was gone from the coat rack, his books from the shelf, his tools from the garage. All that was left were empty spaces that made me realize how much he'd taken, quietly, methodically, without asking. I kept walking from room to room like a stranger, touching the things he hadn't wanted. The girls' rooms were half empty too, their favorite toys missing. He'd packed them neatly, leaving only what he thought I wouldn't need. I tried calling him, but the call went straight to voicemail. The recorded voice of his lawyer answered my email instead. All personal contact is to proceed through legal counsel. It felt unreal, mechanical, like I was being erased by automated language. I replied anyway, asking to see the girls. Hours later came a response with visitation dates, every word precise, every line cold. That night, my mother came over. She looked at me like she was afraid to speak. I told her Daniel had taken everything, house, custody, reputation, and she said softly, "He didn't take it, Corinne. You gave it away." I told her that wasn't true, that I'd just been honest, that he'd twisted it all. She asked, "And what did you expect him to do?" I didn't answer. She stayed for a while, talking quietly about lawyers and next steps, but I barely heard her. When she left, she kissed my forehead like she used to when I was little. That small gesture broke something in me. The next morning, I received another letter. Final judgment. The court had approved the custody arrangement, finalized property transfer, and closed the file. It was printed on thick official paper, as if the weight of it was supposed to make it harder to argue with. I read the words over and over. Sole custody awarded to petitioner. Property retained by petitioner. My name appeared only in the margins, beside the words respondent and notified. I called my lawyer, furious. He said there was nothing to be done now. "It's finished," he told me, his voice too calm. I said Daniel had manipulated the whole process. He said Daniel had followed every rule. He reminded me that no one had forced me to sign anything. I hung up before he could finish. I wandered through the house until I reached the kitchen. The counter was bare except for the envelope. I poured a glass of water and stared at it. The silence pressed against my chest until I could barely breathe. I thought about the last mediation, how Daniel's calmness had felt unbearable then. Now I understood it. It was victory. I wanted to talk to Evan, to tell him everything, but I didn't. He hadn't texted in weeks, and I couldn't bring myself to beg for comfort from someone who'd already moved on. I scrolled through old messages, reading my own words, how desperate I'd sounded for attention. Every line made me smaller. By evening, I went outside and sat on the porch. The street was quiet, the neighbors' lights soft and yellow. Somewhere down the road, I thought I heard the sound of the girls' laughter, but it was only the wind. I wondered if they'd miss me, or if Daniel had already filled the silence for them too. My phone buzzed once more. It was an email from his lawyer. "This will serve as final notice regarding removal of remaining personal items within 30 days. 30 days to empty what used to be a life." I stared at it until my eyes blurred. Then I deleted it. I told myself he was cruel, that he'd planned this to punish me, that no one sane could act this calm after everything. But another thought crept in, the one I couldn't shake. Maybe he'd been calm because he'd stopped caring long before I noticed. When the night finally settled, I walked back inside. The house felt lighter without all the noise I used to fill it with. I sat at the kitchen table and whispered, I just wanted to be loved the way I loved. The words sounded childish once they were out. I thought about how I'd confused love with attention, how I'd used honesty like a weapon and called it courage. The clock ticked in the corner. I looked around one last time and realized he'd won without ever raising his voice. He hadn't needed anger to destroy me, just silence and proof. Everything else I'd done on my own. When the lights flickered, I caught my reflection in the dark window, alone, smaller, still trying to look in control. I whispered, he got what he wanted. Then I corrected myself quietly. No, he got free. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.